So here I am today with Juli McGowan Boit from the living room, and I am so glad to be able to have this conversation with you. I'm so glad that you're here. You're with us. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation.
Of course.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
So Juli had a little bit of an accident yesterday running and ended up with stitches. And so for those of you watching video, you'll maybe see a little bit of a wound, but hopefully we can make it through this next little bit and have a good conversation. Thank you for being with us. We love you. We love Living Room, and I love your book. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that. But also, maybe for those who don't fully know your story, what's the snapshot from a summer mission trip to Kenya, being moved by God, and then moving literally over 9,000 miles to Kenya to launching out this journey called Living Room. How in the world does that kind of journey in life start?
Yeah, I didn't imagine my life would be in Kenya. I was in Los Angeles. I went to Azusa Pacific, had the opportunity to go on a short-term trip, and I really was moved by the experience, by the community that I was in, and now I live there. But I met remarkable leaders who loved their people, and there was so much suffering because of HIV at the time, and we didn't have access to testing or treatment yet. So this was the first time I went was in 2000. Okay. And then I came back, I finished nursing school, but just that experience continued to resonate within me. Yeah. And so I often say that I don't believe we're responsible for things we don't know. But once that God allows us to see or know something, that there's a responsibility that accompanies that. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that everyone who experiences something that they're going to move to the other side of the world. Sure. But in my heart and my mind, like something was birthed during that trip. And so I started working, when I finished nursing school, I worked in an infectious disease unit caring for HIV patients in Los Angeles. And I was here for 3 years, became a nurse practitioner. And just during that season, I just kept going back to the crisis that was going on the other side of the world and this conviction that people shouldn't die alone. And I just felt God's leading in my life, in my heart, to at least consider what it could look like to go and it wasn't like I'm moving and I'm going to live there for my life. It was more of there's an opportunity to go for a year. And that was 17 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. That is amazing. In 2009, Living Room was birthed officially?
Yes. So I worked with Empowering Lives International for 5 years, had an incredible experience of learning alongside of Don Rogers and under the Kenyan staff. But I had a really deep passion that was growing within inside of me for hospice care. And so was really given the blessing to start Living Room and to begin to serve the people who were sick and dying. And I think it's good to clarify that in the U.S., we think of hospice being only end-of-life care and being for the elderly. But in our situation, it was much more of kids and people 18 to 35. Those were the people who were most affected by HIV at the time. And so that was the population we were serving. And what was remarkable is with our HIV patients, they would come to the hospice, and if we could get them the right medication as well as care, then they would actually do very well and come back to life. And so I think it's important to just clarify that, because it doesn't always, when I say we run a hospice, I think there's a different picture than what actually is happening.
And the word hospice for somebody like me, not in the medical community, means sad. Yeah. And you come to, your operation is joy, like in hope and life and even in death, like you say, dignity, but not a sad place. There's going to be laughter. There's going to be music. There's going to be clapping. And I think that was just such a gift to us when our family was able to be there with you guys and to see with our own eyes, just this is a place full of joy and even in suffering. And it wasn't like those two things were separate. They're together, just mixed in there. So I love your book.
Thank you.
And I was just telling you earlier, I love how it feels. I love the design. From Beyond the Skies, a bit of the story and insight into your life. And I love that as I read it, I could visualize some of the places because I've been there. And then also, as you talked about hospital waiting rooms, and those kinds of things. Obviously, I could transport myself back there as we were there with our daughter, specifically Ryan, and some of those stories. But you specifically say this, page 33 to be exact. So much of life and what you were saying yes to is left unscripted. And I just wondered, what have you learned? What are you learning about God, yourself, others, about life in those unscripted moments? We don't always like unscripted moments, but that's part of the journey that you've taken.
Sure.
What have you learned or are learning?
Well, I often say that we have to leave room for God to interrupt our plans, because if we will leave room and space for that, He will. Yeah. And it's not positive or negative. It's just,
It is.
Yeah. And I think that there's something remarkable in leaving space for God to do what He wants to do versus what I had planned. Yeah. And in that, I feel like it's definitely expanded my heart. It has increased my faith. It's allowed me to let go of control at times where, I've tried to hold on to it. And I feel like it's allowed me to see the wonder of following God and Him doing things that I never imagined would be part of my life story.
That's so beautiful. And to see wonder in those moments. I heard John Tyson talk about his wife. He's a pastor in Manhattan, and his wife, they thought she was going to die of COVID. And he talked about God whispering to him, needing windows of wonder. And so he left his wife in the hospital, went home, told his kids, I just need a window of wonder. And I was sort of captivated by that, but I feel like that's even what you're saying. Is that true?
It's
like
absolutely.
The window of wonder? Yeah.
And even in the book I write about, I didn't know how much my child's suffering was going to awake me to kindness also, which I feel like was a gift from God, because I know that's not always the case. Yeah. But there were so many moments in the hospital where I was so moved by kindness. And then as Ryan started to recover little by little, like I was really, really struck by the wonder that I felt, but also like he wasn't saying words and his first word was wow. And like that amazing sense of wonder that I feel was like also embedded inside of me as I watched what felt like was not going to be our story, or, that he was going to get better. So it's been a crazy ride, but one where definitely the windows of wonder. So even, the subtitles, an invitation into the wonder of love, because I feel like that has absolutely been our story.
So a few years ago, I heard you here at Hillside talk about Father Greg Boyle and the impact of this statement. And then it's in your book. And I just thought, I love that statement, but I'd love if you'd talk about it for a moment. He said, now and here and this. What has that meant to you, and how has that caused you to respond differently in life and in circumstances?
I heard while Ryan was in the ICU, I heard a podcast that Father Greg Boyle was on with Krista Tippett, and it was a December morning. It was still dark outside. I was waiting for the hospital team to come around, and I'm sitting there and I'm listening while my child's on a ventilator. Wow. So he wasn't breathing on his own. And he just talked about this mantra that he was living by, that whenever he would go into a meeting, before he would meet with anyone, he would just pause and he would say, now, here, HERE, this. And I listened to it, and something about it just like struck me of, in the middle of this hard moment, I'm going to still choose to be present. Yeah. And it's something that even after coming from that space, like I still think about it so much of the time of like, because I feel like we have all of these notions of what it looks like to follow God, what it means to listen for Jesus. And I think being present, being willing to pause, whether we like the situation or not, can allow us to experience God's presence within it. And so for me, that's what it has meant. Absolutely. And it's helped me, I think, to also pay attention to the people in front of me better than before. Yeah,
I love that. And I feel like it has even grown even more difficult in this season of COVID and distractions and things clamoring for our attention. And I, as soon as I read it in the book, I was just sort of transported to when you were here and you said it. And I just thought, it means today. It feels like even more appropriate than maybe a few years ago when I heard you say that. And in that context of like being present and the now that you face, and there's been a journey these past number of years. In the midst of that journey of being present and now and here and in this, you also decided to write a book. And what prompted that? How do you feel like you came to the place of now's the time to write a book?
Well, I started writing actually while we were still in treatment.
Okay.
So I'd wake up early mornings and I felt like it was a way for me to pray and to process and to try to find words for what we were experiencing. And initially I wrote it thinking this is for my kids because they're not going to remember this, thankfully, but there are incredible things that have come through this season and I want them to have an account of it. But then the other thing is that when Ryan was coming out of the ICU, I had asked a friend, what do you do to say thank you to the people who've helped to save your child's life? And he said, well, you can't repay them, but you write them a letter. And so I think of this book as my long letter of this. You know, they didn't know the stories from Kenya. They didn't know all the different pieces, but I think there's so many people who journeyed alongside of us, people from Hillside, from different churches all over the world, people praying for us and like standing with us in tangible ways. And yet none of them were in all of the different seasons with us. And so I just felt like over time, it became clear to me that this was the letter that I could write as a way to say thank you for journeying with us, for the ways that people have partnered with us and believed in us along the ways. And you know, and I feel like in order for our kids really to get a chance to have life, people needed to stand with us and affirm their worth. And so hopefully it can be an encouragement to people for what they've been a part of.
That's so good. Oh, I love that. That's a long, arduous thank you letter, but the impact I believe is going to be for so many more. Even today, we got the privilege of handing this book out as a gift to our church. And because of your guys' generosity and a partnership, that I just think it's going to be a blessing that encourages so many people who are in these stories and who can learn and benefit from these stories. And I'm grateful for that. You said that,
Aaron, I think if the book would have come out pre-COVID, that it would be received probably different than the way that. You know, like,
and how do you think that is?
Because I think that all of us have now lived through uncertainty. All of us have had certain degrees of loss and have had to navigate what that looks like within our homes and families and communities and the opportunities that we have. You know, like we still have the opportunity to love our neighbor, but it's been a challenging season for everyone everywhere. And so hopefully some of the things that we learned in the dark can help others who are also walking through challenging seasons.
That's such a good point. I got to hear, Todd Bolsinger. I don't know if you know him. He wrote a book called Canoeing the Mountains. We read before pandemic. It's a book about leadership, adaptation. He uses the Lewis and Clark analogy. You get to the mountains, you can't canoe the mountains. But then I read it again early in the COVID crisis, and it meant something completely different. Well, now I went through the lesson again 2 years later, practically, and I'm like, oh my word, it's like a completely different book, and the message is received in a completely different way, sometimes based off the season we find ourselves in. I love that there's this quote, a comment somebody told you in a season of exhaustion: have patience, don't be in such a hurry, like easier said than done. But then you have a quote from a poem that says, above all, trust in the slow work of God. And I've heard it said that God is never in a hurry, but he definitely often seems to be on a different schedule than we are. And how are you how do you pace yourself? How do you find this? Don't be in a hurry, have patience, trust in the slow work of God. The work you're involved in is often not work of quick fixes. So what have you learned about patience and endurance in that journey?
I keep going back. I would say this last year, I keep going back to love is patient and love is kind. Over and over again. I have a friend who we text back and forth, and that's like what we keep writing. And she asked me, she's like, do we have to do both at the same time?
Can we choose either or?
Because that's what love is. And that's what we say we're committed to, but it is hard. You know, like I think apart from God's Spirit working within us, like I am not naturally patient. I'm not naturally kind. And for my kids within ministry, for our community, like we need God's Spirit to teach us how to walk in patience and kindness, because that is what love is. Yeah. So I don't know that I have the answer for how to do it, but I just feel so deeply convicted that, you know, when we say if our guiding question is what does love look like in this situation, the one thing I know to be true is that it's patient and it's kind. And so like leaning into that more and more.
That's so good. Oh, I love that. And this takes me into the next question, but like it feels even more complicated in this season to me than ever before to do that. From the polarization of our world to the divisiveness we find ourselves in. You say that you're by nature a planner. You like to be organized. The new reality we live in is not necessarily that. We sort of adopted a term around here, a phrase VUCA, that we live in a world that's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. And so if you want just like a linear take the next step, it's not necessarily that kind of world. What are you learning about life when you can't always have a clear plan and organized approach? Sometimes it's messy and there's sharp turns in there. But you're a planner and you're organized. Like, how do you find sort of a path forward in the midst of those two sort of things that seem to be in opposition to one another?
Well, one thing I would say is that I think holding on to certainty, planning, that is really something our culture values, and that I've lived outside of our culture for 17 years. And so I really should have a lot of practice at this by now of not having control of situations, or at least I think here we have at least the perception that we have control.
The illusion of control,
And I think that what has happened in this season of COVID is that illusion has come to light. Like we can now see that what we thought we control, what we thought we could plan for, what we thought that was always an illusion. Yeah. But we just had so many comforts around us, like so many things that you know, that made it look like we could control, and those have just come to light, which I think it's part of our idols. You know, like for me, I think it's been one of those things where I have to release this, and not that, I mean, planning is not all bad. I don't mean that, but I just think this sense of control that we think we have, it's one of the things that I think has made COVID so difficult for America is because we think that we can plan and control everything.
That's great. Yeah. And the context you're coming in hasn't really had that as the value or the reality of life.
Right. I mean, I think in Kenya, like I've had a lot of experience living within that. But then, I mean, you know this well, when your kids get sick and have a chronic disease or, you know, something that it's going to be a long time. Like there was a couple years of practice with them being so sick of what I could do from day to day. We couldn't plan out very far. And then I think COVID has collectively like highlighted that for everybody.
Absolutely. And the last 20 months or so have been staggering. And in some ways it's flattened the world from the standpoint we're all in the same place. COVID is a global pandemic. What has COVID in living through that been like in Kenya in this season? Maybe help us understand some of the similarities or differences you've experienced. You know, you've been here in the States for part of it. You've been there in Kenya for part of it. What is similar? What's dissimilar in this?
Well, I think there was the similarity of the unknowns and how frightening it was and how, like, to the degree of loss, you know, I think both probably everywhere, there's the loss of life, but then there's also the loss of like certain events that are important for us. Community is the most important thing. Like it is such a rich culture. I know that often Kenya or other places in Africa, they're highlighted because of what they don't have, but we have rich community. And it's one of the things that we've had to figure out. How do we continue to engage as community when we can't do it in the same way? And I think that, you know, like it was more than inconvenience for everywhere.
Sure.
And within Kenya, many people from day to day are trying to just have enough food to eat. They're trying to survive from day to day. And so when you add these layers of complexity, it felt very overwhelming.
Yeah.
So as far as vaccines, like we still only have 3% of the population who have had access to get vaccinated.
3%.
Yeah.
Wow.
So 6% have gotten the first vaccine and 3% have had both.
Okay.
But when, you look at, and I know that there's a lot of discussion around vaccines, but when I look at the inequities of what's been available in different places in the world, it does make it so we're not all on the same,
right.
It's not equitable in how things have been handled in some ways. And so just trying to process that and wanting protection for our communities. Thankfully, our staff, healthcare workers have been able to get vaccinated, but beyond that, it's been very limited.
Wow. Yeah. What a different experience.
So we run a funeral home, and initially the government actually shut down funeral homes because they didn't want the community to gather for funerals. So they just wanted the bodies to be buried quickly. As over time, we've opened back up, and now, we've been averaging over 100 bodies more per month than what we were before. And so those people weren't tested for COVID, so those numbers aren't going to count. But when I think about just like on a global scale, what has happened and just how to like process all of that, like all of us need therapy. All of us need counseling everywhere. Like we've all experienced loss.
Yeah. Well, I've said here at our church a lot, I think everybody needs to be in counseling, and I still stand by that. But then also I read a book that is escaping me right now, Larry Crabb, on true spiritual community. And he was talking about we wouldn't need therapists and counselors as much if we actually had true spiritual friends. But when everybody's in the same crisis, it makes it different. We're all simultaneously dealing with hurts. And so even in the richest of community environments, like a Kenyan community, everybody's been through the same crisis. And so sometimes it's the blind leading the blind. We're all in the midst of it. And I so think that some people have probably overestimated the impact of COVID, but I feel like the vast, vast majority seem to underestimate the impact. And it's going to take a while to get out of the couple of years we've been living through.
And I think it's important, Aaron, like even as I've just talked about differences of different places, like I think it's important not to compare one person's loss to another loss. Yeah. Loss is loss, and we all have experienced it. And so all of us need to process that. Yep. And I think one of the things that I really tried to do in the book is like we need to be praying unfiltered prayers. Like we need to be willing to go before God in an honest way, whether it's with words or without words or whatever we have, because I feel like God will meet us there. And we need to be reminded that we're not alone. And because I think back to love is patient and love is kind, like without knowing the goodness of God, the loving kindness of God, that it makes it much, much harder to figure out how do I wait? How do I be patient? How do I be kind?
So when you say unfiltered prayers, what do you mean?
I mean that when I feel like when I was a child going to Sunday school, there are certain ways I was taught to pray. And when I got into the darkest season of my life, I didn't have words. Like I didn't know how to pray the way that I'd prayed before. And yet I began to learn, like, so with babies, they don't have words. And I began to think like, there's no way God doesn't hear them. And I feel like God just ministered to me in a way of, I hear you, I see you, I know what you're going through. And because of that, it allowed me to begin to pray in a different way, that I did not know what the outcomes were going to be. And sometimes we talk about hope as a nice, neat, wrapped up, this is how the story ended. But the truth is, like, the hope is that in the middle that God is with us and God's goodness is not dependent on what the outcome is going to be. And with that, like, that's how we can begin to pray honest prayers.
I love that. And unfiltered prayers are sort of what you see in the Psalms.
Yeah.
But a lot of the times the churches we grow up in or that we lead aren't even comfortable with that kind of language.
But it's because it's not comfortable.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing comfortable about not having certainty, of not having that God can fit inside this box, you know, like that's not comfortable. And yet I feel like I've experienced that God is big enough to be there
so
in
good.
that.
Yeah,
So.
that is so good. One of the things I've loved about your story and even being on the ground in Kenya and seeing sort of things with my own eyes, it's that like Apostle Paul prayer in Ephesians 3 that God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or imagine. I don't imagine when you first showed up in Kenya as a college student, or even when you launched Living Room in 2009, that you were seeing what there is now. Yeah. And so you're a visionary in some very fascinating ways, but God has also continually expanded your vision for whatever's appropriate, or, you know, I don't want to spill the beans on whatever, but like, what are the visions God's placing in your heart? And I know He's expanding your territory even as we speak. What are some of those things that, like, it's just like, whoa, only God could do that, and you're seeing those doors open?
Well, I think looking back first, there's no way that I imagined all that God has done. And thankfully, like, He didn't tell me, because I don't think I would.
It would have been overwhelming.
It would have been, but I'm willing to step into the next, like, what's in front of us. I feel like God has somehow given me the faith that I'm willing to be open-handed and do what He puts in front of us. And so right now there's a couple of things in Eldorado that are daunting to me and overwhelming, but also, like, I trust God to guide us. I trust God to provide. I trust God to lead the process. And so over the past year, it's become really clear that we are to become a community hospital, which I didn't envision that. Like, I didn't imagine that. But when I walk that space, like, I know I didn't dream that place. Yeah. Like, God gave us that land. God helped to design that space, and it is stunning. Yeah. It's, you know, I think beautiful what people peaceful. Think of what, you know, what healthcare or something, what might look like in Kenya or in Africa. This, I can't imagine something better. And I'm so grateful for that. And so we're going to continue as we expand services, as we add maternity services and operating rooms and ICU beds and whatever else we may need to add. We're going to do it with the same excellence, the same integrity, and the same commitment to caring for the people who need access to care in affordable ways, and to do it so that their physical, emotional, and spiritual care will be the focus. So another dream that is really deep in my heart is that we will build a family care center. So something that resembles what Ronald McDonald houses look like here. So the model is that families who traveled far for their kids' treatment, whether that be for cancer or a different treatment need, that we want to be a safe place for them to come and to be able to offer care to them. Because when we moved to Los Angeles, a family offered that to us, and I experienced generosity in a way that we needed, and I want that to be available for others. I feel like we are going to be able to love families and their children. And again, it's not even that we know what the outcomes will be of that treatment, but that it matters to God that we love along the way. And so we have done the design and are going to begin fundraising for that, but it's going to be able to house 20 kids and families. So it'll be a 40-bed house. So that's going to be on our Eldorado site too.
That is so exciting. And it really is. It's such a peaceful place. And again, I keep saying this, but such a hopeful place. And just being there, you sense something unique is going on that ground. And
so over the past year, Aaron, one of the things that in the middle of so much hard that I've felt really encouraged by is we were able to renovate Kimbulio, so our original hospice, and we built a chapel that looks very similar to the one in Eldorado. Okay. And so when we went to dedicate it in July, like it was one of those moments where I just felt like this was the vision that we had, was to create a community of compassion that honors life and offers hope. And patients and our staff were sitting side by side in a way where I just knew, like, our patients knew this was for them. Like, in a world that so often tells them that they don't have value or they can't afford this or that, like, they had a space that belongs to them. And I just felt like God's heart is honored by this. And so, I'm really, really grateful that we've been able to do that. And you guys have been a part of, helping to make things like that possible. That, initially, like, I can be credited whatever as being the founder, but the truth is, like, God birthed this. And then now there's 110 Kenyan staff who are daily showing up, and that it's finding its way, to the people who need it through the hands of Kenyans. And I'm really grateful for that.
Wow. It's exciting to get a glimpse of what has been, but it's also exciting to get a glimpse of what can be and what God is stirring in you. 110 staff. I mean, there's a lot of responsibility, but the opportunity is unbelievable. And because I'm sure you've experienced God's past faithfulness, there's an ability to trust him in the uncertainty of what's ahead. What would you say would be the best ways that we, most of us listening to this will be in the United States, that we can pray for and support you and your team in the coming days?
I continue to ask for prayers that we will have the courage to continue to show up and be wholehearted. I think growing up, I thought of, like, courage and bravery as these, like, really noble things. But courage is being willing to step in places where they're scary. And I feel like God, as God gives us courage, where it may not be the most natural thing, like it may be hard situations, but if we'll have the courage to continue to show up and do it wholeheartedly, like that is where we are able to love the people in front of us. We're able to honor the lives of the people we're entrusted to care for. And when we do that, like, I feel like all of the other things will fall into place. But, we are humans. And so we need God's strength. We need God's wisdom. We need God's provision. And we also, like, as there's opportunities to step into different spaces, we want God to lead us because he has faithfully led us to this point. And so there's just that ongoing tension. And I feel like we need to live in the tension of waiting on God, of listening, of, being present. And so those are some of the things that I would love prayer for.
That's so great. I think, we're pretty close to Hollywood here. And so the definition of courage is the momentary act of taking a bullet or whatever for somebody. And sometimes it's a lot harder to be a living sacrifice and daily surrender over and over and over again. And courage really comes out in the long haul.
And that we don't ever arrive. Like, I think there's people who look at my life at times and think, she moved to Kenya, like that was the ultimate sacrifice. But the truth is, it's like, it's daily showing up. And sometimes daily is too long. It's like moment by moment, being willing to be present, being willing to be interrupted, being willing to, like, experience the pain, but also the joy, because you can't actually, I don't think you can experience the fullness of joy without being willing to also accept the pain that comes with life too.
So good. I want to thank you for writing from Beyond the Skies. I want to encourage, I guess you can get this anywhere books are sold, online especially. And I want to encourage anyone listening or watching to get this and to dig into it and to sit with it a little bit. I think sometimes not just like speed reading through, but sitting with it and even saying, like, God, speak to me through this story. For people maybe who are still trying to find out about you, your story, Living Room, what's the best way to find out what's going on in your life and in Living Room?
Sure. So the book can be found at FromBeyondTheSkies.com.
Perfect.
And also for those who are reading the book, there's a digital, like an online experience.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of videos that were captured during our storybook.
So it starts to come to life as you watch those. Yeah.
We just felt like we wanted that to be a part of what we shared. So I'd love for people to be able to find that. Yeah. And then the other thing about the book is at the back, the last page, it's one of the visions that I had is that I don't actually want the book to sit on people's shelves. Like, I feel like it's more it's more than selling copies of book to me. It's that this story, I'd love for it to find its way to the people who need to read it. So after you read it, if you're willing to sign it and pass it on to someone else, I would love for it to find its way. So the last page looks like an old school library card, and I would love for it to find its way into the world that way.
That's so great.
But I can be found, I don't love social media stuff, but I can be found at Instagram at Juli McGowan Boit. And at Facebook at the same. So
it's so good. Thank you so much. Thanks for taking time. Thank you for modeling so well for us perseverance and vision, courage and faithfulness. And I'm just so glad that we had this time to sit down and talk. Thank you. And we will be praying those prayers for courage. We will be praying those prayers even for provision as these visions start to take more root and more definitive needs arise, that God would do again exceedingly abundantly above all that you ask and imagine. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.